Okay, everybody, welcome back to Thoughts and Bolts. This is part 7 of our series into OSAP, specifically the leaked documents that have come out recently. This is going over again the 10-month report, and we're going to focus on project engagement. Project engagement. What was project engagement? You can pause the video now if you want and read over this on your own, or you can just jump to the abstract. Quote, the goals for project engagement are to deploy high value resources, including carefully chosen human personnel, remote viewing capability, and sensors into areas where recurring evidence of advanced aerospace vehicle activity had been documented. In particular, project engagement seeks to focus on how human consciousness slash awareness can interact with the technology involved with advanced aerospace vehicles. Putting it in simple terms, project engagement is about using psychic abilities to make contact with UFOs. Okay, that's it. Okay, this looks a lot like what Skywatcher is doing right now in the open. Okay, Jake Barber and his crew. And this looks a lot like CE5, C SETI, that Dr. Richard Greer, Dr. Stephen Greer was doing for so long. I'm sure Stephen Greer doesn't mind being compared with a movie star that women all over the world love. Richard Greer, Stephen Greer, okay. Dr. Stephen Greer, C SETI, CE5, okay, all that good stuff. So that's what this is, project engagement. Okay, using psychic abilities to see if they can influence UFOs. Okay, that's what that part was, that part of ASIP. Now, why? Why are they doing this? In this document, it says that during the Stargate period, mind you, I did skip about 20 pages. Okay, went from page 158 to page 173. Why? Because in between, you have a very interesting account of an encounter with a non-human intelligence, which is actually also in part in chapter 1 of Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. So buy Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, read chapter 1, and you'll be able to read what I just skipped over. Also, read Annie Jacobson's book, Phenomenon, which is about the CIA remote viewing program, and you'll be able to see what I just skipped, because the part I just skipped also deals with the history of the CIA remote viewing program, Project Stargate. But basically, why do they want to apply remote viewing to? And I'll explain in more detail what remote viewing is. Why do they want to apply remote viewing, clairvoyance, psychic abilities to this issue? Well, simply because during Stargate, there were times when these remote viewers saw UFOs. They saw alien stuff, okay, on this planet and within the solar system, okay. Here it says that RV detection of exotic events and technologies relevant to the BOSS initiative occurred during Stargate, okay. These included detection of apparent basing facilities for exotic craft, description of apparent exotic craft accidents, and UFO surveillance of military targets. The latter correlated with independent, national resource records. Okay, so the simple way to translate this is that back during this Project Stargate, CIA remote viewing program, when they were using psychics to spy on the Soviet Union or to look at the war in Iraq, hostage situations in Italy, uh, sometimes they detected UFOs, okay, or on this planet Earth and other planets in this solar system. Okay, so even though that wasn't the focus of Stargate, it did happen occasionally, so it's totally relevant to this more recent UFO program. Now, the protocols of remote viewing are described in the next page. Basically, um, it shows how they were going to go about this. Okay, so first, the assignment of remote viewing tasking to previously calibrated remote viewing team leaders slash teams. In other words, for OSAP, they were going to use veterans, okay, people from previous remote viewing programs. So that's important, okay? They weren't going to bring in new people and try to train them for this. No, the CIA already had a crop of battle-tested psychic spies, and so we're going to use them. The second, the use of blind targeting so as to minimize analytical overlay due to expectations or pre-biases, i.e., no front loading. So remote viewing is a very specific protocol. It's clairvoyance, it exists, it's real, and remote viewing was a very specific protocol related to clairvoyance. Now, no front loading, analytical overlay. What does this mean? Okay. The three major enemies for a psychic spy are imagination, guessing, and memory. Okay. Imagination, guessing, and memory. Okay. And this is why a remote viewer cannot know the target beforehand, must not know the target beforehand. Okay. If they do, it's not remote viewing. Okay. It's something else. Okay. But remote viewing requires that the remote viewer be totally blind to the target. Why? Because if they're not, if they know what the target is ahead of time, okay, they might use their imagination, they might guess, they might remember, confuse a memory they had with what is actually happening. Okay. Um, totally being blind to the target ensures that imagination, guessing, and memory are kept to a absolute minimum, that they do not encroach in the process at all. Okay. Analytical overlay is when a remote viewer perceives something, senses something about the target, and then thinks about it, right? So rather than just drawing it, he says, is that a plane? Is that a crucifix? Is that a bird? What is it? I don't know. I'm afraid of being wrong. Okay, I'm gonna write it's a plane. That's analytical overlay. Okay. And front loading is the process of telling the remote viewer about the target in advance. Giving them information in advance is front loading. It's considered cheating, and it actually ups the likelihood that the remote viewer is actually going to be wrong. Okay. So that's why it's unwise to ask a remote viewer, hey, can you remote view the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, or what, or can you remote view what happened in Jerusalem 3 days after he died? Why? Because the remote viewer is going to use their imagination, they're going to guess, memories are going to, maybe things they've seen in movies are going to come in, and they have no way of knowing if, what they're seeing is what actually happened versus what they saw in a movie, or what they're guessing, or what they're simply imagining, due to their own preconceived biases, right? What if they're Christian? What if they're Muslim? What if they're Jewish? What if they're atheist, right? If they know what that target is, specifically the crucifixion of Christ or the resurrection of Christ is ahead of time, they're going to be influenced by their religious beliefs. Okay, so no front loading, no information whatsoever. It has to be blind. Now, I only mentioned the Christ thing because Sean Ryan on his podcast interviewed Angela Ford and asked her about the crucifixion, and she didn't answer, because she's a professional and ethical remote viewer. She knows the limitations of studying those kind of targets, what they are. Okay. Now, generation of complete remote viewing session records in the form of tape recordings, drawings. Okay, that's standard, right? They're going to create something, you want to record it, you want to document everything. Okay. Integration of data from multiple remote viewing sources. So, if possible, we're going to try to use multiple remote viewers on a target, um, and then follow-up efforts to provide for independent VMV on the basis of ground truth reality whenever feasible. So in remote viewing, that's called feedback. Okay. Remote viewer must receive feedback. Okay. If they don't receive feedback, then they don't learn. Okay. Remote viewers need on the job training, and it never ends. Okay. So they need to know if they were right or if they were wrong. Okay. And if they were right, they'd like their confidence increases, and then they remember, like, okay, why did I get that right? And they remember that, and then they remember that the next time they remote view to discern, some impressions that are real versus some impressions that again are just imagination, memory, or guessing. Okay. And if they're wrong, they want to know why they were wrong. Okay. They're gonna, oh, why I know why I said that. I know why I wrote that, or I know why I got this wrong. And all these things are part of their continuing education. Otherwise, without feedback, um, and Angela Ford in her Twitter recently said the reason why she didn't answer that question is because there's no feedback. Okay, none of us can go back 2,000 years in the past to watch the crucifixion and see if someone's remote viewing of it, or Easter Sunday for that matter, is accurate, right? So they need feedback. So it's part of their continuing education and to keep them honest, right? They need to keep themselves honest and see if they're losing their edge or not. Because if they keep doing remote viewing targets without getting any feedback, they will lose their edge because they'll have no way of knowing, of discerning what was their own imagination versus what was actually coming in from the subconscious, right? So feedback whenever feasible. Okay, that's the key word because with the UFO phenomenon, it's something so ephemeral that you're not going to get 100% feedback. And but you can get some, right? But again, you have to remember that this isn't, targeting a UFO or a UFO base is not the same as targeting a Russian submarine or the site it's constructed on. Okay. The former is much more ephemeral. And so you're not going to get the kind of feedback you would like from a more mundane target. We can still get some. And to the extent they can, they will. Okay. Now, did they ever pursue this? Remember, this is from a 2009 report, July 2009, 10-month report, and this was their plan. Okay, they wanted to use remote viewing because they hadn't yet. And did they carry this out? And it turns out that yes, they did. Okay. In 2010, Joe McMoneagle, one of the veterans from the CIA remote viewing program, or DIA, or because this program jumped around. But, you know, Joe McMoneagle, one of the former Army/CIA remote viewers, did a remote viewing of the ranch. Okay. And Katsky and Kelleher tell us about it. Okay? And it's basically what we just read. Okay? They followed through. From time to time during the Stargate program, remote viewers had detected exotic events and technologies relevant to the OSAP initiative. Okay. These included detection of apparent basing facilities for exotic craft, description of apparent exotic craft accidents, and observation of exotic craft surveillance of military targets, the latter correlating with independent national resource records. This reads just like a quote from what we just read. Okay, so props to Lakatsky, Kelleher, and Knapp, George Knapp, for doing such good research. Look, they basically just quoted the document we're going over right now. Okay. Um, in March 2010, Bill McMoneagle, one of the premier remote viewers in the US, was tasked to observe a target designated as 22610 using traditional blind targeting protocols. Okay, remember, he cannot know what this target is because we don't want him guessing. We don't want, old bits of memory creeping in, and we don't want him using his imagination. Okay, and we don't want him using Google. Okay, we don't want any cheating at all, and we don't want anything, any kind of analytical overlay. We don't want him to think about the target. That's the point. You want the information to come in. Okay. 22610 was actually Skinwalker Ranch. Blind targeting protocols mean that he had no knowledge that the ranch was his target. As expected, McMonagle's sketch of the Skinwalker Ranch, description of the environment, animals present, and characteristics of the two ranch managers and two security guards were excellent. But he indicated that a fifth individual was also present. McMonagle described a male, 60 to 70 pounds, with a height of 4 foot 3 inches, with no hair. Age was not able to be determined. Exact physical features were unclear, as opposed to those of the managers and guards. McMoneagle said that the fifth individual could not be seen by ranch personnel, but did attempt best communications with them to see their response. He indicated that the communication was not precise or clear, and to the individuals on the ranch, it would seem to come from above or behind their heads. Okay. And here is Joe McMoneagle's drawing of Skinwalker Ranch. Okay. He didn't know it was Skinwalker Ranch, but this is Skinwalker Ranch. Okay. Um, and I mean, he nailed it. Okay? He nailed the geography. He nailed the number of personnel, but he also described a fifth person, okay, a man, 60 to 70 pounds, with 4 foot 3. Anything under 5 feet tall is a midget. Okay. So he basically described a male, assuming it's a full grown male, right? Somebody basically the size of a midget with no hair on the ranch and nobody could see. And that this person didn't have very clear physical features, and he tried to communicate with the personnel on the ranch. Okay, mind you, this personnel is working for AAWSAP. They are on a Pentagon UFO program studying the Uinta Basin because it is a UFO hotspot. Okay, so these DIA employed through Bigelow Aerospace UFO researchers. Okay, there's four of them on the ranch, two security guards and two ranch managers. Okay, and basically, yeah, there's a fifth person they're not aware of, and he's a bald midget. Okay, and this person tried to communicate with them, but it failed because they would sense the communication as being from above their heads or behind their heads. Okay, that sounds like a non-human intelligence. And if you want to talk about feedback, wow, I'm sure Joe McMoneagle got to see this picture compared to the actual location of Skinwalker Ranch and was able to see that it's on point. So that's very interesting. They had a plan to use psychic abilities to make contact, and they seem to have made some kind of contact. Okay, probably it's all very interesting and very impressive. But now we get to Kona Blue, because remember, uh, this program, OSAP, was not a top secret program. It was classified. It was a classified UFO program, but it was not a special access program. It was not a SAP. Okay. And I've talked in other videos about their attempt to make it a SAP and why they did. We won't go into that, but they try to make it a special access program, and they tried to give it and find it a new home, which is normal. Remember, the psychic spy program bounced around from Army intelligence to CIA to DIA. It bounced around. And they wanted a new home for it in the Department of Homeland Security. And so what you see here is Kona Blue. Okay, that was going to be the new code name, right? It was called OSAP. Now it's going to be called Kona Blue. It was going to be a Department of DHS Science and Technology unacknowledged wave special access program. Okay, so what you see here with Department of Homeland Security is an unacknowledged wave prospective special access program. Okay, now these documents that I'm going over right now weren't leaked. They were released by the DoD last year. Okay, and as you can see, they used to be top secret. Um, Now, the OSAP program never turned into Kona Blue, right? It didn't find a new home at the Department of Homeland Security. So when you look at the Kona Blue slides, you have to understand that this is essentially a sales pitch, okay? It's a sales pitch to keep the program alive in a new department and that's why it's called a unacknowledged waves effective special access program. And by the way, these USAPs are the most secret of the secret. And again, we've described in past videos and will describe in future videos why that was, why they wanted that. But Harry Reid was championing this effort to make it a USAP, and it got shot down. Um, but this is what they wanted to do. Okay, the consciousness center. Okay, there are multiple things they wanted to do, just like they were doing multiple things with OSAP. Okay, but the consciousness center is essentially, if when you think about it, it's a continuation or an expansion of project engagement. Okay, but the consciousness center was intended to manage the acquisition, training, and utilization of remote viewers and communicators. It's very interesting wording. Remote viewers and communicators. Is there such a thing as a remote communicator? Is that a thing that we haven't learned about? Is that still classified? Apparently not. I mean, we have it here, or are they just counting on people not being able to read? But um, so remote viewers and communicators. Does that mean remote viewers and remote communicators? Or is this some kind of communicator I don't know about? Who knows? So they wanted to train people. Okay, so rather than, in the OSAP program, they were using the veterans from the CIA program. Apparently, they were going to train people. Okay, and they were going to use these unorthodox techniques because they have been proven to be critical collection methods, um, which supplement efforts within, data collection, events, tech, and all that good stuff. They wanted to develop training and quality assessment program for consciousness studies, conduct assessments both remotely and on site. And it goes further. We wanted to focus on known hotspots. Okay, we already seen that with Skinwalker Ranch. Are there other hotspots? But they wanted to extend remote communication programs to communicate and retrieve data across dimensional slash space-time barrier. Okay. So again, this is interesting. You have remote viewing, okay, remote viewers and communicators, and then you have here the specific mention of remote communication, okay, not remote viewing programs, remote communication programs to communicate and retrieve data. Okay, so you can say the remote viewing is about retrieving data. It's not exactly about communication. Okay, to communicate and retrieve data across dimensional slash space-time barriers. Okay, so it seems like the two running theories here for the UAP, for the UFO, at this point is either extraterrestrial or interdimensional. Okay, they wanted to develop remote viewing and remote communication countermeasures. Okay, so this is more than just a UFO program. Okay, they wanted to develop countermeasures against remote viewing and remote communication. What is remote communication? Okay, if remote viewing is a euphemism for clairvoyance, then remote communication would be a euphemism for telepathy. And this sounds a lot like what Skywatcher is doing, and right now in the open. And it sounds a lot like what we saw recently with the telepathy tape kids, right? Um, so this is more than just clairvoyance, remote viewing, which we saw during the OSAP years. They wanted to extend this to telepathy, okay, remote communication. They wanted to study consciousness interactions with and control of technology. I talked about that in my whole Lockheed Martin UFO secret series, and we'll talk about that again later in a different episode. But they wanted to conduct experiments to determine baseline parameters for physical transport against dimensional slash space-time barrier, okay, as opposed to communication and data transfer only, okay. I'm going to get into that in my next video, but there are declassified documents now that show interest in Chinese parapsychological studies. Okay, so the Chinese, They do parapsychology too, and their government studies it as well. Okay. And there was interest in the United States in what the Chinese were doing. And again, this isn't weird. Okay. We had interest in what the Russians were doing, right? We started a remote viewing program in the United States in CIA because the Russians were doing it first. Okay. They called it psychotronics. Okay. And and so if you look at, and I think I'm going to do my next episode on the Chinese parapsychology because what they were doing is apparently they were doing experiments with psychics who could move objects from small objects from one place to another. They could tell, apparently, according to these reports in Chinese parapsychology studies, they had people that could move small physical objects from one place to another, teleporting them. Okay. I know it sounds weird. Okay. But they apparently wanted to see if they could do that too. Okay. So that's science. Okay. It's not enough just to read, oh, look, there's these parapsychologists in China, working for the Chinese government who were doing teleportation with, psychic abilities. Oh, that's so cool. No, they wanted to see if that's true or not by replicating the experiments themselves. Okay. So now we're going past remote viewing. We're going past clairvoyance. We're going past telepathy into telekinesis, essentially. Okay. And the deliverables, again, experimental results and assessments reports will be produced on each separate activity. Okay. So this is all very weird and very awesome. Okay. So to recap, okay, project engagement. They wanted to use psychic abilities to make contact with UFOs, specifically with remote viewing, right? They wanted to make a psychic contact, where you would have visual contact with something, right? If you see something, you've made visual contact, right, with your eyes. Doesn't mean you communicated, okay, but you made visual contact with something. So they wanted to use remote viewing to make contact with UFOs, non-human intelligence. They had a plan for it. They followed through on that plan with apparent success, right? Um, that's all very interesting. Who the heck is this 4'3" bald guy, 60 to 70 pounds on the ranch? No one can see, and who's trying to communicate, but he can't. People hearing him are hearing him above their head and behind them. It's weird, right? And again, they wanted to go from a classified program to an unacknowledged waived special access program. So from what I understand, what USAPs and people on UFO Twitter know what this is. Um, Basically, no one can know about this program. The only people that can know about this program are on a bigot list, like by name. Their name has to be on that list. And it doesn't matter if you're the president of the United States. If your name is not on that list, you cannot know about the program. That's what they wanted to do with OSAP. They wanted to change it into something else called Kona Blue, which was basically OSAP on steroids. Okay. And remember, in this episode, we're focusing on, you know, what is this? Project engagement. This episode is about project engagement. And if they had gotten their wish, okay, if the Department of Homeland Security had taken on this program, project engagement would have turned into the Consciousness Center, which would have been doing just really far out experiments with parapsychology. Okay. Going past clairvoyance to straight up telepathy and telekinesis, teleporting things, maybe, right? And again, this all has to do with the UFO phenomenon. Okay. It's a thoughts and bolts phenomenon. And I think that's part of the genius of the whole Bigelow Aerospace era was that they figured out what experiencers have been saying forever, that this is a thoughts and bolts phenomena. Okay. You cannot study UFOs without falling down into the consciousness, pipeline, right? The consciousness wormhole. There's a UFO wormhole. Okay, everyone who gets into it thinks they're going to knock it out in 6 months. They don't. And you get sucked in because there's so much to learn. And eventually you go down into this, UFO to consciousness pipeline. And it happens to everybody who goes into the subject long enough. And you start getting into idealist metaphysics, parapsychology, right? Telekinesis, clairvoyance, all that good stuff, telepathy. And apparently it happened at DOD and it almost happened at the part at the, you know, what is it? Department of Homeland Security. Okay. Project Engagement was cool and was on the right track. So with that, I'm going to end. Learn how to meditate. Learn how to meditate. Look inward. Look outward. Um, Learn to meditate. Be a psychonaut. At the end of the day, it's all about consciousness. Everything leads back to that eventually. And with that, I bid you good night.